A Bitter Taste by Purefoy's Girl. Chapter 7. He didn't realize he'd fallen asleep until he heard someone call his name, by the sound of it not for the first time. Will? He lifted his head enough to look over his bare shoulder, finding Hannibal standing in the doorway, with his finger still on the doorknob.
"If you're not too tired, would you care to join us?"
he asked, his impassive face giving no indication of how Will should answer.
"Alana has expressed a desire to get to know you better."
Will rolled over and sat up, absently rubbing his neck, a quick glance at the clock showing him it was 2:15 in the morning.
"Is she drunk?"
he asked, sitting there with his feet braced on the smooth bedside rug, dark curls falling in a riot over his eyes.
"No, she isn't,"
Hannibal said. Will noticed he was wearing only a dark-colored robe and that his hair was mussed, falling over his brow. The robe was belted negligently, hurriedly, revealing an expanse of hard, furred chest and belly. Will dropped his hand from his neck and gazed at Hannibal for a long, silent moment before saying,
"You changed your mind then, Dr. Lecter. I think, under these circumstances, it will, in fact, help me learn more about you,"
Hannibal said, referencing his earlier refusal.
"She did the asking?" "Yes,"
he was told. So, no coercion on that count.
"Do I have a choice?"
was next, accompanied by full eye contact, as much as he could muster.
"You always have a choice, Will,"
Hannibal told him, content to stand there all night if he needed to.
"She won't be disappointed long."
It was a goad, and Will knew it, and it irritated the hell out of him that it worked. He got to his feet, making his languid way to the door, asking,
"Are you going to kill her if I do this satisfying of her curiosity?"
"No," Hannibal said, blinking slowly.
"Not for this."
It had to be enough, because it was all that he was getting, and Will knew it.
"I was bored anyway,"
he said, his lopsided grin fading when his brain caught up to the current events. He wasn't sure if his invitation to Hannibal's room included consent to be touched by him, and he was soberly reminded that he'd never done such a thing before in all of his long, long life. "Would you care to join us?" he'd said, subtly confirming that he had no intentions of vacating his own bedroom for their tryst. No, Will thought, moving out into the hallway with Hannibal just behind him, skin prickling with awareness of his gaze.
"You would have just sent her to my room for that."
From the look of things, they'd already warmed up. The bed was rumpled, its wide mattress holding Alana's lovely, bare body in its center. She was blindfolded, something that brought Will up short quickly. He could feel the heat of Hannibal's body at his back, distracting him, and he turned his head to say,
"Does she have a choice?"
The bitterness of that question stung him for some reason. Choices and regrets. He left it lying there at the corner of his mind, focusing when Hannibal moved around him, saying,
"It's by her request, Will, not my requirement."
She hooked her thumb beneath the blindfold just enough to tease a glance out, and said, "Sorry, it helps. I can take it off if it bothers you."
"No, it's fine,"
Will told her, feeling annoyed and out of place as Hannibal moved to fondly stroke her hair.
"Just, is this normal for you two?" "It's occasional,"
Hannibal answered, earning a soft, stifled laugh of mortification from Alana.
"Alana is doing some experimentation with her limits. She often asks me for my assistance."
"So this is some kind of sex therapy?" Will asked, glowering.
"If you'd like to consider it that way, you certainly may. Suffice to say, Alana is genuine in her desire to know you better, and I can honestly tell you that you won't be bored."
"Not likely in this house," Alana softly agreed, nipping Hannibal's fingertips when he touched her mouth. Will took a deep breath and let it out slowly. He'd done this thousands of times in the course of his life, granted not ever with someone he had anything other than murderous feelings for. So what was once more? At least he was well fed enough that he could perform without needing to tear into her. "Will?" she asked, almost embarrassed. "Are you okay? I mean, you don't have to do anything if you don't want to do."
"Not like it's a chore,"
he told her, snatching at his charm, which had been strangely hit or miss since meeting Hannibal Lecter.
"You're very beautiful, Alana."
That prompted a modest, pleased laugh, and she held out her hand, fingers outstretched in invitation. She was slender, but not too thin, weighty in the best places, alluring and self-conscious by turns. Hannibal slid from the bed and moved to tend the fireplace, giving Will a moment to make the transition to her side. Will took another deep breath and went to her, feeling her small fingers close over his own tightly, tugging him to join her. Her skin was warm and soft and sweet-smelling, tangy with her previous presumed romp with Hannibal. Her fingers walked up to his face, touching his mouth, nose, feeling the firmness of his jaw. "Don't worry," she whispered, biting her lip on a smile in a way that went straight to places in Will's heart it had no business being. "It's not as kinky as it seems at first blush." He laughed softly, too, some measure of tension leaving him when he felt for himself that she was relaxed, in her right mind, and willing.
"You got a head start,"
he said, hands shaping to her warm body on their own, knowing the routine. "Hannibal said you'd be more comfortable that way," she admitted, feeling the length of his throat and the breadth of his shoulders.
"I also said he'd be more comfortable blindfolded as well,"
Hannibal reminded her from just behind Will's shoulder, turning up silently, the fire banked and glowing at his back. He thread his fingers into Will's hair, his touch bringing prickling heat to Will's scalp, and tugged to bring Will's blue eyes to his own.
"Well?"
Will hesitated, wanting to ask what all he was agreeing to, but not wanting to alarm Alana, his boredom rapidly vanishing beneath the weight of his curiosity. Hannibal leaned down, his lips tickling Will's ear when he breathed.
"Deprived of sight, your other senses will become more keen. Considering how bored you've been, Will, perhaps it wouldn't hurt to try."
"Should I be offended by that?" Alana questioned, her hands falling to Will's waist, thumbs tracing the soft curve of muscle where his belly began to narrow into his groin.
"Never,"
Hannibal assured her, and surprised her with a kiss. That was you," she said, licking her lips. "That kiss I know." Will caught Hannibal's gaze and gave him a short nod.
"Go ahead."
That earned himself a sharp, shocking tug on his curls that made him gasp. He was still stinging when the world vanished behind a heavy blindfold that Hannibal snugged expertly to his head, warning,
"No cheating, either one of you."
"Girl Scout's honor," Alana said, her hands more brave now that Will couldn't see her. It was far more disorienting than he thought it might be, not having his sight. Will had spent centuries looking at things, judging their worth and being by what he could see of them, allowing those images to shape his perceptions and opinions. Shuttered behind his lids with no accompanying visual feedback, he conjured Alana's feminine form into his mind's eye, through touch alone. Her small waist, round hips, the heavy softness of her breasts tipped with tight, responsive nipples. He painted a picture in his mind of her, soft lips and strong teeth, round cheeks and a firm little chin, melding the feeling of beauty into a vision of it. Yet he didn't kiss her. Found himself tipping his head to one side when her questing mouth came too close to his, and started his exploration of her body all over again, to avoid something that seemed far more dangerous to him in that moment than anything ever had before. Slowly, the thing that had become an old and routine task became fresh again. He'd forgotten the allure of a young, sound body after decades of aging, experienced ones. Though Lana had experience and obviously enjoyed her own sexuality, there was still an element of experimentation to her touch that he found himself echoing back to her, giving her the illusion that they were on equal footing in that regard. And yet, the image of Hannibal broke through the mosaic of Alana's body in the darkness behind his eyes, time and again, scattering her image like shards of glass with the sharp clarity of his own. It confounded Will, honestly, because he wasn't altogether sure what his attraction to Hannibal was, only that the man drew him, the first human in decades to be of even minute interest, gifted with the incredible ability to surprise Will over and over in the smallest ways. Will tried again to focus, keeping thoughts of those dancing dark eyes out of his head to concentrate on the woman beneath him. He thought killing was messy work, But it turned out sex could be just as messy. Laughter and gasps and mistouches. His skin rediscovered sensation, sensitive to the sweep of her fingers and nails, soft lips and blunt teeth, the encompassing pressure of her body as if she were 3 women around him instead of one. It was a tangle of teeth, fingers, limbs, the very impersonal nature of it making it even more enjoyable. He had no agenda with Alana, nor she with him. The only one with an agenda was Hannibal himself, who made his presence known when Will was buried between Alana's legs, tongue coiling over and inside of her, her thighs tensing and moving against his cheeks and steadying hands. That was when he heard her moans change tenor. She hissed and arched, sounding strangely muffled. He started to raise his head and felt Hannibal's hand press on his curls, staying him, his voice deadly calm when he said,
"She's ready if you are, Will."
She bucked against him as if in agreement, and knotted her own fingers with Hannibal's in Will's curly hair. Realizing what probably filled her mouth only served to inflame him, his fevered imagination launching into a scenario that made him ache. Careful in his growing arousal, he worked her as hard as her body allowed, teasing and suckling until she shuddered roughly and arched against him. Her hand slid from his hair and she panted, gasping for breath with her mouth finally freed. Hannibal's own fingers tightened, pulling, urging Will up onto his knees. Rather than risk losing his curls, he did as he was directed, his skin rosy from Alana's bites and kisses, from her scratching nails and tender fingers. Even breathing was a distraction for him, his entire body quivering with growing need he never imagined he'd feel again. When Hannibal released the hold on his hair, Will simply let his head fall back, breathing hard, feeling the heaviness in his groin growing weightier with every pump of his thundering heart. The touch along his spine was not Alana's, no. Her hands were fluttering over his belly, seeking. Yet it was the brush of curled knuckles down the knobs of his spine that made Will catch his breath, keenly hungry to know what Hannibal was willing to give to this. "Hannibal?"
"I'm taking care of it, Alana."
Will nearly jumped out of his skin when he felt Hannibal's warm, long-fingered hands skim up the length of his swollen cock. He actually yelped, startled by it, so attuned to his touch that it hurt despite how good it felt. He welcomed the fear it instilled, this hyper-awareness of Hannibal. The fear just fed his arousal, and he trembled hard when Hannibal gripped him, pinching his cock hard beneath the head, forcing another tight, harsh sound from between his clenched teeth. It was shameful to be positioned this way, guided by one steady hand until his swollen crown touched slick, wet heat. Yet the shame, too, he was greedy to feel to its fullest. He felt the fingers of Hannibal's other hand then, spreading Alana open, brushing the length of him as he sank deep. She moaned beneath him, but Will almost didn't hear her. He was lost in himself again, blanketed in darkness that allowed his imagination to wrap anything he desired around his pulsing body. He held there, haunches tense, Alana's thighs spread around him. He felt Hannibal's thumb slowly stroking her, the brush of his wrist bumping Will's lower belly, his other hand flattened on the lean muscle of Will's hip. She rolled her hips beneath them then, and he had to move, the sum of her reduced to a silky sheath rippling around him. He heard a man gasping, ragged and throaty, and shuddered when he realized it was his own voice he was hearing. And yet it wasn't quite enough. This exquisite level of pleasure had been lost to him so long that his body was slow to respond to it, reluctant to open nerve endings that had numbed with time and overuse. His fingers clenched on her soft, curvy hips, and he bit back a frustrated moan, sucking in a breath that hissed over his teeth. "Will?" Alana breathlessly asked, sensing something wasn't quite right. The squeeze and clench of her body changed tone, becoming deliberate and rhythmic, but it still wasn't enough. 2 warm palms cupped his hips, and Will's breath hitched again with surprise, each time a startling shock to his system. He was electrically aware of Hannibal in a way he'd never felt before, as if there was a place inside of himself that could only be unlocked by the man smoothing the damp skin of his belly.
"Where are you right now, Will?"
Hannibal asked, pressing close to him from behind, chest to his back, skin to skin, all the way down. He shuddered, fingers clenching at Alana's round hips. She dug her own fingers into his forearms, perhaps warning him he was too close to her limit. Again, the warmth of Hannibal's breath and the soft low purr of his voice asking,
"Where are you right now, Will?"
The breath he took burned him down to his belly. His voice cracked on a moan when he answered, "Here." The hands on his hips moved, brushing him, hitching Alana's legs up higher. He felt the man shift against him, fit so tightly to his back that every ripple of movement from one forced a reciprocal dance from the other. Hannibal's hands slid beneath his, dislodging his hold on Alana's hips.
"If you're here, then show it. Stay with me, Will."
"I'm here," he breathlessly said again, teeth clenching and head falling back when he started to move again. He was helpless there between the friction of their bodies, buried over and over inside of Alana, Hannibal guiding her hips from the front and setting the pace from behind, the hard curve of his cock wedged tightly against the round heft of Will's backside. "He's fucking her," Will realized, gasping for breath, his arms sliding back out of Alana's grasp to grip Hannibal's slick sides, fingers digging deep. "God, he's fucking her through me." Will surged hard, the yearned-for crest of orgasm flirtatiously out of reach. Hannibal bit him again, nuzzling his neck to lay a grazing kiss beneath his jaw.
"Not yet. Ladies first, Will."
"Oh my God, Hannibal!" Alana moaned, and Will felt her hands flutter over his belly, desperately seeking purchase as her body tightened in spasm around him. She found and covered Hannibal's wrists, clinging tightly.
"Alana?"
Hannibal questioned, slowing the pace, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. "I'm fine," she gasped, tilted beneath him now, every stroke deep to the hilt. "Antiversion."
Did I hurt you?"
Will asked, shuddering. He'd felt her come just now, knowing female orgasm well enough after all this time. But sometimes pain was pleasure, and pleasure was pain, and it wasn't always clear which one was present in the heat of sex. It took her a moment to decide. "Not exactly, just... Jesus, that was a rough one."
"Would you rather be on your belly?"
Hannibal questioned, still no tremor in his voice, no sign that he was the least bit affected except for the thrumming flesh snuggled so tightly to Will's backside. He found himself pushing into it, wanting to hear Hannibal make some sort of noise, wanting to get some kind of reaction in return for the reactions Hannibal had somehow teased from him. Yeah, I think that would be better," she admitted, stretched tight around him. "You've got a curve to you, Will." She laughed as she said it, all forgiveness. Will's breath hitched when he was forcefully removed from her, Hannibal's expert hands dragging him back into the warm, hard curve of his body. Will didn't drop his hold on Hannibal's sides, just shifted with him, fingers tracing silky hardness that his mind assembled into smooth hip bones, trailing down thighs that were muscular and covered in downy hair, not at all like those of the woman before him.
"Here,"
Hannibal said, nudging his exploration aside. She rolled over in the midst of Will's distraction. He wanted to ask why she was still here, but he didn't. He wanted to ask Hannibal what he wanted, but he didn't. He just let those hard hands guide him again, crowding him close to the warm heft of Alana's backside. He could have taken it from there, but Hannibal didn't give him time, or else demanded to have this much control over things. It was a thought that sent a spike of thrilling pleasure through Will's lower belly, and a responsive bounce through his cock when Hannibal's fingers closed over him again, wringing another gasping moan from his lips. She was loose, finally, but no less satisfying, slick with combined efforts, and swaying complacently with his deep, sharp thrust. It tore a sweet moan from her, prompting him to gain speed and force until everything was a mingling of gasps, slapping flesh, and pure sensation. And still it wasn't enough. He wasn't willing to feel less than everything, not willing to settle for a routine finish when longed-for orgasm promised to actually materialize. The bed shifted, tipping him slightly, and he shuddered when sharp teeth grazed his sensitive earlobe, a hot puff of breath spilling against his skin as Hannibal bit down in earnest. Will gasped, back-arching, mounting urgency in his rhythm. Alana worked back against him, the angle changing when there was a sharp crack of flesh on flesh that reverberated through her round backside.
"Ass up, Alana,"
she was told, the hold on Will's ear released, and she shifted. Will felt her sharp fingernails skittering over his pumping hips when she reached back, seeking purchase against his onslaught. She was tightening around him again, seeking her own promises. The noises she uttered were animal and beautiful, a litany of sound that made his blood beat harder through his veins. Hannibal shifted behind him. Will felt the brush of fingers between his spread thighs, and choked on a moan, shuddering. The light touch on his sack almost did it, brief as it was, and he tightened in response to Hannibal's cupping hand passing under him. Alana cried out beneath him, and Will could feel those fingers, those clever, sensitive fingers, using the frantic jarring of their bodies to slide slickly from Alana's straining core to the base of Will's cock when he plunged deep, his thick wrist brushing Will's tight sack with each thrust.
"Oh my God,"
he moaned, or maybe it was a prayer, or maybe it was just enough to finally get him where he wanted to be. And then he felt heat on the skin above his hip, followed so rapidly by warm, wet lips that he couldn't make sense of it until Hannibal's teeth were sinking into his skin. Will almost sobbed, the shocking pain of being bitten almost enough to finally do it. He closed his eyes and threw back his head, still praying, still moaning, Alana long forgotten. When those teeth finally breached the resilience of his skin, stars blossomed in the darkness behind Will's lids, and the heavy rupture started. He barely registered Hannibal immediately releasing the bite on his hip, barely realized when his hand moved swiftly between his thighs, so those same slick fingers could lock tightly around the base of his cock, squeezing so hard he thought he might pass out for a moment. But it was only a moment, only long enough to disengage him from Alana's hot, trembling body and drag him back against Hannibal's own. So quick enough that the first spurt of cum slapped onto his heaving belly. Quick enough that there wasn't a break in his searing pleasure between the squeezing heat of Alana's body and the squeezing heat of the hand that forcefully milked him. He arched and thrashed in the cradle of Hannibal's hard, warm body, every nerve ending firing in rapid sequence, transforming him into nothing more than a taut line of liquid sensation, moaning senselessly with pleasure. He felt Hannibal's heart thundering against his back, hard enough to echo between his shoulder blades. But that might have been his own heart, straining and leaping. He thrust up into the tight fingers wrapped around him, shamelessly and greedily using them to feel more, to feel it all. Hannibal's other hand smoothed his curls, his cheek, and finally delved between his parted lips, stifling his moans. Will latched on, instinct driving him. He latched on and sucked, his brain making the contours of the body he felt beneath him into vivid reality. The stiff, straining heat against his backside pulsed responsively to the force of his heaving. Hannibal's corded hips straining up against him to savor the friction. When Will bit down on the fingers in his mouth hard enough to draw blood, he wasn't the only one coming, and the hot spill of sticky heat that flooded up the curve of his wiggling ass sent another spasm through his aching cock. A second rupture left him teetering on the edge of overload, straddling that fine cusp of pain and pleasure he was fast discovering was his very favorite place to be. "You..." Alana's voice broken with panting, exhausted and amused. "You cheated." The hand stroking him slowed to a stop, but stayed tight around him as if daring him to soften. He could feel the pulsing slow against him, and pushed into it, winning a catch of breath and a deliberate squeeze in retaliation.
"I didn't,"
Hannibal said, and finally there was a tremor to his voice, some audible sign that he wasn't immune to everything as he seemed. He was panting too, the depth of his breathing lifting and lowering Will, who lay splayed out atop him in blissful, mindless aftermath.
"You're the one with your blindfold off."
Something landed on Will's stomach, warm material smearing in pearly strings of cum all over his belly. Hannibal's thumb brushed gently over the tip of his cock, where it peeked from the top of his fist, an idle stroke for a pet who'd done as he'd been bidden. "Maybe I wasn't done," she said, catching her breath, the bed shifting as she moved.
"You think by now I don't know when you're done?"
Hannibal inquired, his throaty laugh a pleasant vibration against Will's back. "Cheater," she insisted, her laughter fading as she padded away to the bathroom. "Shame on you, Hannibal." Slowly, Will was able to catch his breath, hoarding the fading sensations to feed him when sex became just another tool to hunt with. He floated in the moments between, in a place where he didn't question why he was laying like this, and why he resented the loss of the warm hand wrapped around him when Hannibal let him go.
"Are you sleeping?"
Hannibal inquired, nudging him. He shifted beneath Will's weight, the press of his body uncomfortable now that he was spent.
"Will, I wanna be,"
he admitted, and tensed to sit up, but was stopped by the lingering stroke of a touch skimming down his belly through cum and sweat alike.
"How do you know my boredom was a problem?"
he asked, his sweaty head falling back over Hannibal's shoulder so that his throat was a long, sweet line.
"It wasn't that much of a reach. It would be the first comfort sought, and quickly grow stale from use, especially given your proclivities to play innamorato to your prey."
His other hand covered Will's throat, rising to the bait, tracing the firm lines that might later become a drawing.
"He's memorizing me,"
Will thought, and the reasons why were more thrilling than frightening.
"Is that why?"
There was a considering silence. Hannibal rarely spoke without thinking.
"No, Will. You were safe enough here tonight in Alana's presence. I thought it would be a good opportunity to see just how much of your experience you've shut away."
Will laughed softly, amazed that he could participate and analyze at the same time.
"Did you learn anything of value, Dr. Lecter?" "Yes, I did."
He shifted, easily moving Will to sit up between his spread legs. There was a tug at the back of his head, careful now not to pull his curls, and the blindfold dropped to land in a puddle with the other one, a heap of forsaken cloth on the ruined sheets between his pale thighs. He rubbed his eyes, blinking hard, Hannibal's cum cooling against his lower back. The mattress shifted hard to his left, nearly tumbling him out of the bed as Hannibal stood and stretched, lithe and loose-limbed, his tousled hair making him seem much younger than he was. Or maybe he just put on a disguise of being older, like Will put on that of a flirtatious, naive boy. Hannibal held out his hand, those dark eyes steady again, steely. Will could hear Alana in the shower, singing, or maybe calling for them. There was blood on Hannibal's fingers, caught under his nails, and Will realized his hip was still oozing. The perfect imprint of teeth in his hip was starkly red and ragged against the white of his skin, and he irrationally wished it would stay.
"Shall we?"
Will met his gaze, searching for a reflection, lost for a moment in those black hole eyes. Wordlessly, he took a steadying breath, and put his hand in Hannibal's, wondering if he'd already committed to so much more than he originally intended.
"Doesn't look as swollen,"
a woman said, her voice piercing a haze of darkness. Will came out of his deep, dreamless sleep when he felt something brush his side, soft skin sliding over his hip where Hannibal had bitten him. He lay still, taking stock. He was enveloped in the downy softness of warm sheets and heavy comforter, wrapped in the warmth of two bodies, one of which was sitting up at his back, legs still entangled and touching him cautiously.
"It's still there?"
He flinched at Alana's touch, bewildered that the bite mark hadn't vanished with the morning light.
"Maybe it hasn't been long enough."
He never really kept track, just knew that his wounds always reknit themselves by dawn.
"Perhaps it wasn't as bad as you thought it was,"
Hannibal offered, his warm chest rumbling against Will's limply curled hands when he spoke. One arm was wrapped high over Will's side, and his head was tucked beneath the man's jaw, curls moving with every word.
"You drew blood, Hannibal. Don't patronize me,"
Alana said, teasing, but still a very real warning. She rubbed her hand over Will's hip once more, softly so as not to pain him, and sighed a little, coiling back down against his back and around him to reach the man on his other side.
"I saw you at dinner. What did you do to panic him?" "Nothing,"
Hannibal said, amused, lifting his arm to draw her closer to Will's back and to his own embrace.
"I merely saw an opportunity to address one of your more sticky religious taboos."
"Ah, that," she breathed, pushing her nub of a nose into Will's nape. The pulse of her breath was pleasant against his skin, as was the warmth Hannibal was giving off. He very nearly slid back into sleep, content to leave them to their talk. But then she said, "I think that's the most dishonest you've ever been with me, Hannibal." He was silent. Will imagined he was looking at her with those deep, steely eyes, weighing where she fell on the scale of inconvenience and food.
"Yeah, I noticed, and yeah, I didn't like it when I realized,"
she said, pressing down Will's curls to rest her cheek on her hand.
"Addressing my hang-ups was secondary to whatever you were determined to get out of Will. So, did you get it?" "Yes," he said, his voice low, soft and dangerous. "Did you?" "Yes, Hannibal.
saying thank you seems a little unnecessary considering your motives. But yeah, I'm over the hump."
"I doubt he would protest more practice,"
Hannibal said, still cautious with her. "No, but you would," she said, and moved again, leaning over him. Will felt her long hair brush his shoulder and arm as she kissed Hannibal, and then she was up and moving, leaving fading warmth at his back. Dinner was amazing, as was the hospitality.
"Is there anything you want me to tell him?"
Hannibal inquired, though by now Will was sure he knew he was awake. "Nope," she said, thumps and footsteps as she dressed. "I'll work on mornings after another time, maybe. I'll lock the door when I leave."
"Leave it open. I'm expecting deliveries,"
Hannibal said, apparently not concerned by her hasty and rather tense exit. Instead of wrapping his arm back around Will in the ensuing silence, he ran his fingers through Will's furious curls in a semblance of affectionate petting.
"Still playing possum, Will. Seemed better than getting tangled up in whatever that was,"
he admitted, unwilling to open his eyes. He'd never faced the darkness behind his lids the same way again after last night, all things considered.
"That was an accord, one doctor to another,"
Hannibal said, still petting his head. Even this close his touch was impersonal and detached, lacking any real connection to bring it to the level of intimacy.
"She was concerned about your hip. I must admit, it's worse than I thought it would be."
"Then you thought... Is that why you bit me?" Will asked him. His skin tingled where the bite ringed his flesh, the sudden rush of his blood bringing renewed sensitivity to the surface.
"To see what would happen to someone like me." "Perhaps,"
Hannibal said, a throaty chuckle rumbling in his chest.
"But if memory serves, it also enabled you to make the final hurdle and a little marathon last night, Will."
Will laughed and rolled onto his back, tipping his head to look at Hannibal, whose hand slid out of his hair with the movement and lay draped across his chest.
"Are we cuddling, Dr. Lecter? You've developed unhealthy relationships with sexuality and intimacy, Will,"
Hannibal informed him, not even blinking at that one.
"I was simply not pulling away."
Will blushed, and he couldn't believe it. He really couldn't believe it. There was no embarrassment or hiding, not from Hannibal Lecter. Perhaps he was a connoisseur of flesh in more ways than one. Or perhaps he had not been taught as Will had, the shalls and shall nots drilled in with violence, nails in the soul of curiosity and freedom. "So I'm a clingy sleeper? Should have put a lot in the middle," he said, hovering around indignant because he refused to acknowledge being honestly embarrassed at his age. It only worsened when Hannibal said,
"I did, actually. Unfortunately, she had to get up in the night and forfeited her place."
"Unfortunately," Will echoed, annoyed by the whole idea of it, himself traversing the width of Hannibal's bed like the man was every bit a beacon in his sleep as he was while waking. Hannibal smiled his slight, delighted smile and added,
"For Alana, of course."
It was mollifying, and that only pissed Will off worse. Hannibal tossed back the covers and got up, naked and lithe in the late morning light, leaving Will to his own devices as he headed into the bathroom. Taking the opportunity to salvage some little bit of his dignity, Will scrambled from the bed and straight for the shower in the guest bedroom ensuite. He mulled over last night, the hot water chasing goosebumps over his skin. He'd been excited, aroused for the first time in decades, jolted from staleness by something as simple as a blindfold. "No," he admitted, ducking his head beneath the hot shower spray. "It wasn't the blindfold. It was Hannibal." Everything last night had only been possible because of Hannibal's guiding, controlling hands. There had been something so easy in that, so effortless in allowing someone to take over for him, positioning him like a doll working through him. And the very act of it, allowing himself to be taken over, had in turn fed his own libido, all of it erupting in the throes of that final act of dominance, being bitten. Will's hand rubbed over his hip when his mind conjured the moment for him, feeling the individual punctures lined with raw, sensitive skin. Hannibal hadn't been shy. He'd sunk his teeth deep, as if he'd intended to take a mouthful out of Will. Maybe he would have, he thought, his shudder not from revulsion, though nothing he was quite willing to name. Will looked down in shocked surprise to find himself sporting an admirable erection, and he just as quickly ignored it, dismayed at the cause. He was sufficiently calm by the time he got out of the shower and dressed quickly. Despite Hannibal's solicitous suggestion, Will hadn't actually gone anywhere of quality to get his clothing. He'd never bothered with that kind of thing and didn't intend to start now. Jeans and a button-down were more than sufficient. He'd bought a sturdy pair of work boots to replace the sprung, broken ones he'd arrived to Baltimore in, but he preferred being barefoot. The scent of Hannibal's aftershave lingered in the hallway, warmth and cardamom, earthy like something elemental would smell. Will followed it downstairs, realized it headed in the direction of his office, and found a note on the sideboard for him.
Will, please take this list to the farmer's market for me. It will certainly be more entertaining than anything you'll find here. My appointments will be done by 2.
He signed it in his flourishing script. A neat pile of bills lay on the sideboard along with 3 woven totes.
He's serious?
Will asked aloud, brows pulling together in consternation. Then, again, it wasn't like he had a plan. He never did when it came to Baltimore. There was something he was looking for, but since he didn't even know what that thing was, it was almost impossible to pin down.
Well, at least he's a distraction, Will sighed, annoyed that he'd have to put shoes on.
His stomach rudely growled, spoiled in such a short time. He patted it absently, the mark on his hip pulling and burning beneath the roughness of his boxers and jeans, situated just perfectly so that both pieces of clothing bisected it. Surely it would vanish by noon. Deciding to take the chance to see some of the city, Will did as he was bidden and headed out into the light of day, flinching from the light, as all dark things must flinch in the end. He wandered the usual streets, retracing his steps of lifetimes ago. Things had changed and changed again, modernizing, squeezing closer, the press of humanity like a heartbeat of lifeblood into the city where he'd been reborn.
It was here, I remember,
Will thought, crossing and recrossing places that seemed familiar, haunting. Was it his life before that called to him, or another visit here? Another later time pretending to be one of those rare, real gems of his life before rebirth? Yet no matter how he searched, he never found his ancestral home. There was every chance that it had been torn down over time, or refurbished beyond recognition. Even when he stopped to imagine it, he couldn't find anything specific. Smells, tastes, the textures of home were all known to him, but he could barely conjure the 4 walls that encased those things. Save them, he thought, pausing on the street to close his eyes, his clearest memory vivid with fear for his mother and sister. Save them. Did I? He murmured, his eyes slowly opening. He simply couldn't remember. He'd made his deal with the devil he still didn't know, in the hopes of saving them, and spent eternity wondering if the bargain had been kept. Why can't I remember? A man on his cell phone gave him an alarmed glance in wide berth, his attention enough to bring Will back to himself. He was absently rubbing his hip, aggravating the ring of marks that still hadn't healed.
Where are you right now, Will? Stay with me.
Unnerved, Will altered his course for the farmer's market, spending hours combing the stalls for the things Hannibal had listed, asking here and there after those he could not find on his own. It was as good a way as any to spend a day. After all, it wasn't as if he didn't have thousands more to spend in the future. The house was, thankfully, quiet on his return. Will wasn't sure what to do with half of what he dragged home. He just set the bags on the counter in the kitchen. It was after 3, so he knew Hannibal wasn't with patients, unless someone had dropped by unexpectedly. Rather than rattle around the house in a fugue, he decided to seek him out. He had things to talk about, after all. His hip had still not healed. Hannibal was in his study, diligently working at some unknown task, his back to Will.
I wondered when you'd return,
he suddenly said, turning to offer Will a smile.
Please, come in, Will. Have a seat if you'd like. What are you working on?
He asked, choosing to drift closer instead. It was like nearing a place where lightning had struck, the air sharp and prickling with danger that raised the fine hairs on his nape. Of the 2 of them, which one, indeed, was the monster?
Notes for submission,
Hannibal told him, putting his pens down and sitting back as Will settled against his desk.
Were you terribly bored today, Will? No more so than usual, Will said, his smile somber. Your things are in the kitchen. I kept the change.
Hannibal's mouth curled in a half-smile, amusement dancing in his dark eyes.
Hannibal,
Will started and trailed off, unsure how to phrase it. He took a deep breath and made himself meet Hannibal's unflinching gaze, asking,
What are you?
Hannibal cocked his head just slightly and blinked, turning that question over in his mind before saying,
I'm afraid that's too broad a question. Or is there something in particular that's bothering you?
The bite mark hasn't healed, Will said, hitching his shirt up to show the knob of his slim hip, his other hand pushing down the loose lip of his jeans and boxers to reveal the bite in full.
It's as bad as when you first gave it to me.
He feigned concern well, Will had to hand it to him. He was every bit the solicitous doctor as he examined the bite, but with a clinging air of smug gratification just beneath the surface that nearly ruined the illusion.
It's not infected. Not likely to be if you keep it clean.
That's not the point, Dr. Lecter. The point is, I heal clean by dawn. Always have.
Not always,
Hannibal reminded him, tugging Will's shirt back down in a wordless dismissal.
You're human once, Will. You healed the same as anyone else. Or don't you remember?
Will glared sharply at him, prompting Hannibal to say,
I assumed, of course, that you weren't born in your current state. You seemed particularly out of resources when you asked me if I knew what you were, because you do not know yourself.
He certainly did not want to get into that. Will gazed down at him, very sure that Hannibal was skirting his original question, and figured what went for Hannibal went for himself as well. I asked you how you knew boredom was a problem, and you said something about my playing the lover to my victims. How did you know that, Hannibal? How did you know I tend to sleep with my prey? Hannibal blinked, pleased with him.
I doubt you were with Matilda for her boundless enthusiasm when it comes to gossip. And you were quite intent on snaring me as well. Or do you now claim I was not, in fact, one of your intended victims?
No, Dr. Lecter, I wouldn't say that.
Am I one of your victims still?
Hannibal asked, as bland as he would be if discussing the weather. Will smiled wolfishly and told him,
I haven't decided yet.
You're interesting, Dr. Lecter. The wound you gave me doesn't heal. Your preference in food is the necessity that keeps me alive.
Color me intrigued. I shall strive to remain entertaining, Will,
Hannibal told him, smirking.
However, I can easily admit to being equally as entertained by you. You're a curious puzzle, Will Graham.
There's nothing puzzling about me, Will sighed, thinking of the past, the transformation that had landed him centuries out of his natural time, seeking out places he couldn't remember, and missing a family he no longer knew.
Save them all. Will?
Hannibal's voice cut into his memories, slicing through with the precision of a well-honed blade.
Would you like to tell me?
He shook his head, his voice unsteady when he said, No, not unless you'd like to tell me what you got out of watching me with Alana. Besides the obvious, of course.
I'll tell you anything you like, Will,
Hannibal said, no hesitation, no wavering in those black hole eyes. It seemed so earnest, would feel that way, too, if Will wasn't able to follow where Hannibal ever so slightly turned the subject to one he would actually discuss. Then tell me why you decided on that after you had all night long to consider it, Will said, so intent that he managed to actually hold Hannibal's gaze. You were weighing your options, weren't you? So why did you settle on that?
Because I was curious,
Hannibal purred, as if that was excuse enough.
I wanted to see how deeply insulated you'd become against emotional attachment.
So that shit you said in your kitchen? Will asked, almost angry.
I won't have anything less than the whole of a true lover, Will,
Hannibal said, his mouth tightening.
Letting you into my bed to pursue a farce of intimacy for the sake of your expectations was less than appealing to me. And please, don't be vulgar.
So, you let Alana crack my shell for you? Will asked and laughed, shoving away from the desk.
Is that what you perceive to have happened?
Hannibal asked, his voice sharp with intent. For whatever reason, something important hinged on the answer, and his interest made Will hesitate, considering before he answered.
No. She was just a tool,
Will finally said, gesturing helplessly, frustrated with himself.
You were the one who did the cracking.
He looked pleased, damn him, satisfied. A cat who caught the canary. Happy now?
The level of petulance doesn't suit you, Ganymede,
Hannibal said, standing abruptly. He'd shed his jacket, but kept the vest, a rich dark blue against his pale shirt. Even without the jacket he was stern, imposing, and strictly in control of himself. Will didn't buy for 1 second that the cuffs Hannibal checked were out of place. They simply wouldn't dare.
There's a reason you've built your walls, Will. What is it?
Excuse me?
Those walls I had a singular pleasure of breaching this morning,
Hannibal said, his humor replaced by predatory curiosity.
They were built for a reason. Once upon a time, the boy who feels nothing now felt everything all too keenly, didn't he?
Will flinched, shocked, his eyes widening as if Hannibal had reached right into him, plunging his fingers through the empty space where his soul had been, to find a splinter that, once withdrawn, made him bleed profusely.
What? You built your walls to protect yourself, Will. But I wonder, how many times did you mourn your victims before you sealed your mercy inside?
Will shook his head, retreating a step, memories beating at his brain, the fluttering of frantic raven's wings against the glass of his mind.
Did you weep for them, Will? Did you look down at their dead faces and name yourself a devil?
Hannibal murmured, the world narrowing as he drew near, reduced to the purr of his voice and the bright, feverish sparkle of his dark, dark eyes.
How long have you been hiding your true self, Will? How long have you lived?
Centuries! He snarled, lashing out, infuriated. How dare he? How dare he? His blazing blue eyes rose and Hannibal smiled, welcoming it. I died centuries ago, and every death since then is a weight around my neck. Hannibal pressed both warm hands on his shoulders, stilling him, crooning with all the tenderness of a lover.
Only if you let it be.